There's been a massive backlash to immigration in the last few years that has been part of a larger right-wing populist surge across the globe. Why has there been such a massive backlash to immigration, and how can we design a system of immigration that is not just fair to immigrants and economically beneficial, but also generates public support for immigration? That's a really important question, and it's the subject of a new book by Alexander Kustov called In Our Interest: How Democracies Can Make Immigration Popular. I think this is a really important conversation because no matter how well designed our immigration system is, according to economists, according to the models that we use, if it is not politically sustainable, then it's simply going to generate backlash and potentially hurt immigrants in the end. And I think this is something we've seen over the last few years. And so we need to figure out how we can do this. So I invited Alexander Kustov on the show today to discuss his book. Why do people fear immigration? Why are they negative on immigration? What are their underlying motivations? How can we make the benefits of immigration more clear? And how can we design a policy system that will garner support? Are there international examples to imitate, examples to avoid? Alexander and I discuss all of this and more in today's episode. As always, thank you for listening. If you want to like, comment, subscribe, share it on social media, all of those things are greatly appreciated. And if you want to support the work that we do here at the Center for New Liberalism, the best way to do that is by becoming a member. You can go to cnliberalism.org/become a member, get involved with the local chapter, influence your local politics, join our community, join the discussions that we're always having, get free swag, get free bonus episodes of the podcast. All of that is available for members at cnliberalism.org/become a member. One more time, thank you for listening and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me today is Alexander Kustov. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jeremiah. I'm glad to be here.
So this book is really fascinating to me. You've written a new book called In Our Interest. It's about how democracies can make immigration popular. And obviously, this is something that my organization thinks about a lot. We are, from the very beginning, we have always been very, very pro-immigration. And that's a tough thing to be right now, whether you're in America, whether you're in Europe, in many places around the world. So before we kind of get into the central question of the book, I think it would be good to kind of take a step back and just assess like where we are as a society, I guess, and how unpopular is immigration right now? And in your view, how did it get that way? How did we get to the point we're at right now?
Yeah, right. Let's jump into that. I don't think that immigration is popular at all in most places right now. I think the only exception I can think of that I talk a lot about in the book is Canada, which also had some setbacks recently. But with the exception of Canada, maybe Australia, and some unique cases in Western Europe or whatnot, it's really hard to think of a place where the vast majority of voters would be okay with kind of the existing flows, right? And what I'm trying to do in the book is essentially to figure out how people can support more open policies durably, right? I think what effectively we have right now in the U.S. and many other countries is this kind of thermostatic back and forth where we have a new party in government and it's right wing, and then people become more pro-immigration as a result because they do something draconian. But then we have a more liberal party come in, and then people lash back because they perceive the whole system to be chaotic. And then in the end, we basically don't have any sustainable support anywhere. And I don't think that's good for anyone. I think one thing that I really want to highlight is that it's not just a liberal um, aim or good goal to have to make immigration popular, right? It's not just for the liberals. It's a good idea to have this goal. I think conservative parties also. It's in their interest to have their own immigration policies to be popular. And I don't think that's also something that we see happening anywhere in the world right now.
Yeah, it's easy as an American for me to kind of tell the American story here, which is, like you said, the most popular I think immigration has been in the last few decades in America has been under Trump's first term. The backlash to Trump and the kids in cages stories, and all of a sudden people were very sympathetic. But then you had this, the COVID happened, and I think there was kind of a pent up demand. No, basically the border was shut down during COVID. And so when we kind of were like, okay, we're not shutting down the border anymore, we got this flood of people coming in a not a very orderly way, let's say, many of them coming in illegally. And a lot of that was just repressed demand from several years. And there was a really hot job market in America, so anytime the economy is booming, you get more immigrants coming in, and it led to this severe backlash that we're dealing with now. And I think it would be very easy to just make that American story, but like you said, this is happening everywhere. This is happening in many, many different contexts. So it can't just be about, thermostatic American politics or whatever. There's got to be some kind of deeper reason why people are so distrustful of immigrants, of immigration at large. Why do you think that people dislike immigration in the first place? Is it something to do with race? Is it culture? Is it they think that their material interests are being harmed? What do you think is kind of the root of why people are so negative on immigration?
Right. I think it's $1 million question, Jeremiah. I mean, if you kind of look at the academic literature on the topic, and that's kind of what I'm doing in the book in the very beginning, taking stock of what, people have written about in the last 20 or 30 years. And, I would say a lot of people just say straightforwardly, it is racism and xenophobia, and there's nothing else to it. In fact, right now when I'm promoting my book on Twitter, I see people quote tweeting me and saying, "No, it's all racism. Why are you writing this book? It doesn't make any sense." Well, I think there's a lot of nuance here, right? So I'm not denying that there's a lot of racism in this world, and this can potentially be one of the major factors that predict why people oppose immigration, but it's also not the thing that explains the vast majority of variation in people's opinion, right? And we also see that.
Can I also add,
Mhm.
if it is just all racism, if like it's 100% of the backlash to immigration is just a bunch of racists, then we're screwed. Like if 60 to 70% of the country is just irredeemably racist, like that's a majority, and we're just never going to win. So I think we have to hope that the racists are only a small minority, and that it's other reasons, because other reasons maybe we can deal with. If the majority of society is just hopelessly racist, then what are we going to do about it? I think that's something people don't think about when they just say everyone is racist.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I think it's even actually more pessimistic than them, probably, because we know a lot from like psychology research that those kind of ethnocentric predispositions, those are like personality traits, right? It's not something you can pretty much change at all. It's something that is either genetic or due to socialization, right? So if it's true that it's all due to racism, that there's literally nothing we can do. But at the same time, I think ironically, I think it's also kind of convenient just to say that, it's all their fault, right? It's not kind of people's racism. It's just like the racism of the populace, right? And they kind of zombify, or, they use propaganda, misinformation, and they just kind of make people xenophobic even when they're not. But I think it's a too convenient of a story, if you know what I mean, right? I think there must be something else going on, right? Especially if you consider that the variation in terms of people's support for immigration, just empirically, if you look at various countries or years, even in the Gallup survey within the U.S., right? There's a lot of variation and ups and downs, right? And I think if it's all about racism, I don't think that would just explain all of this, right?
The other thing is, if you say it's just all racism, that means that you, as a liberal or progressive or whoever you are, saying that you don't have to change anything about what you're doing. It's not your fault. It's not because you took an action that was a mistake. You can just blame it on someone else.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's why I'm saying it's a little bit too convenient, right? And I think if you really have to summarize my argument in like a sentence, I would say that the only way to make immigration popular is to make better policies, right? And if you are saying that it's already all good and it's just like racism that prevents people from supporting and embracing immigration, then you don't have to do anything. You don't have to come up with any new policy solutions that are more mutually beneficial to different parties, right? I think you just ignore this reality, the complex reality of the fact that immigration has conflicting interests, right, and has conflicting effects on different parties and groups and individuals, right. I like you. I believe that I was completely inspired by Michael Clemens' work, right? And the idea that immigration just has so much potential, so much more than any other policy we can think of internationally, right? But I think it's also the case that the way it's operating right now in the US and many other countries, it's not the best possible way it can be.
So we're kind of rejecting the explanation that it's just racism. And I think that's probably correct. But if it's not just racism, then what is it? Because step one, it seems to me, if we're going to figure out how to design an immigration policy that will have wider support, that we can have immigrants coming into our countries and have the public support those immigrants, we have to understand how they're feeling about it before we can design the policy. So what do we think it is if it's not racism?
So the way I frame it is, I call it altruistic nationalism, and it's a very simple idea that a lot of people, they generally care about others. They're willing to even incur personal costs to benefit other people, but they prioritize their compatriots. A lot of people who live in kind of old nation states like the U.S. and like a lot of the European countries, right? They primarily think of themselves as citizens of their country. And to the extent they care about others, they really think mostly about how different public policies impact national interest. And it's not just immigration. I don't think immigration is that special here, right? If you think of any public policy, right, usually what we want to have from those policies is to benefit the public good, right? For those policies to be in the public interest, and and I think immigration should be exactly viewed the same way, and that's how people view it, right? And it's also in line with a lot of research and public opinion about so-called sociotropic concerns, and that's the idea that a lot of people kind of base their perceptions on different policies and attitudes, not just in terms of how those policies impact their themselves personally, but in terms of how they impact their countries. And I think the only thing that is somewhat special about immigration is that I think it's much harder for folks to know how it impacts their personal interests, their kind of material concern that they have kind of egotistically, just because, it's really hard to calculate that. Like I personally, as a professor, I have no idea how, new Trump policies are going to impact my situation on the job market, let's say, whether I'm going to be more competitive in the academic job market or less. It's very hard to calculate those things. And I think that's kind of one of the reasons, as opposed to, let's say, taxation or something like that, right? So I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of people kind of primarily base their attitudes on immigration in terms of their sociotropic concerns.
It's funny you say the your particular role, like as a professor. I've often heard pro-immigration professors, like I think Brian Kaplan says this, that like his job is more exposed to immigrants than almost anybody, because there's so many professors from around the world who would all love to teach at American colleges, and so it's a very competitive marketplace if you had true open borders, like for academics, for professors. But no, what you're saying about I think you called it like nationalist or altruism. It kind of reminds me of that. There's this meme image that's been going around different circles of social media. It's been going around X, and it shows like what they call the moral heat map.
Mhm.
And, it shows like what is your moral circle of concern. And typically liberals kind of have a further out moral center of concern. They might be concerned about all people all over the world. They might even extend it to all animals all over the world. Whereas conservatives tend to have a much smaller heat map of like, I'm concerned about my family or my town or my country. And then I kind of stop and I don't care about the people outside that circle as much. Is this kind of in the same direction as what you're getting at, that people, they're altruistic, but within a certain smaller circle than you or I may be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Yeah, the only thing I would say is that my understanding of that map is that it's not very well done in terms of kind of the data collection and research that went into it. I haven't done much research on that though. But so if you want to go a little bit into the weeds, so actually what I've done for my research here is that I did a bunch of those kind of variations of the so-called dictator game that is very common in behavioral economics, where basically the idea is that you have several participants, and then some people are given a chance to basically get a price, let's say a couple of dollars, and then they can basically decide to split the money with some other person. And then if they do that, since there are kind of no reputational concerns of any sort, you can interpret it as some kind of form of altruism or kind of pro-social preference. And so what I do in some of my surveys, basically, I add an additional nuance to that. Basically, I give people an opportunity either to keep a prize of $100, which is basically raffled, or they can decide to donate it to a charity of their choice. And this charity can either be national in orientation or global, and it's all matched. So it can be either, let's say, National Red Cross or the International Red Cross. And then basically by looking at what people do in this kind of donation task, we can sort of kind of reveal their altruistic preference and how parochial they are. And what we see actually there is that the vast majority of people are more likely to donate to domestic charities, national charities, as opposed to kind of local charities or global charities. I think one thing that I really cannot emphasize enough in the book is that those kind of humanitarian motivation or kind of cosmopolitan altruistic motivations, they are real and they exist, and they're probably prevalent among people like us in academia, among immigration advocates, right? But they're very, very rare in the kind of general populace. So, just to put some number to it, it's almost never more than kind of 10% of people who are willing to actually benefit foreigners or kind of the world as a whole before they benefit their compatriots or themselves. So it's like a very tiny number. And so basically what it means is that you cannot really use those humanitarian motivations to base any kind of meaningful support or immigration policy in terms of kind of just coalition building and politics.
It's so interesting because completely separately from immigration, like I'm a big advocate of, you should send your charity dollars overseas because they do a great deal more overseas. They're more effective. You get more bang for your buck. You just get a more efficient use of your dollar when you're donating to like prevent malaria or blindness or vitamin A deficiency or whatever overseas, as opposed to donating it here at home. Certainly you can do a lot of good here, but we are already a rich country. We are not where the most pressing needs are. And my experience has been similar to what you're saying, is that it's very hard to get people to kind of make that leap, and they're much more inclined to donate close to home for better or worse. But I think this raises an interesting question in terms of how do we build a case for immigration. There are kind of two different ways that you see this. You can see immigration as a form of charity, and I think you tend to see this with more like the further left positions, people who would like to call themselves leftists instead of liberals. They often make the case for charity in terms of like it's a humanitarian goal. we owe it to these refugees, or, maybe we did colonialism in the past and therefore it's our obligation to do this. And it's kind of this charity argument almost versus an argument about self-interest, which is, someone like Matt Iglesias doing the 1 billion Americans saying like, I want a strong America. I want America to be number one forever. And that's why we need more immigrants. Do you see those two things as polar opposites? Like, can you make the case for both at the same time, or should you really be just emphasizing kind of the self-interest case?
Yeah, so I think, they're definitely not mutually exclusive, right? I don't think we have any evidence that by emphasizing one aspect, you're kind of de-emphasizing the other one or something like that. I think, from a lot of kind of basic economic research on immigration that we know of, right? We know that immigration can potentially be mutually beneficial to all parties involved, right? On average, at least. And so here, I just think that, first of all, rhetorically speaking, right, given that the number of people who are really truly humanitarian is very, very low, again, less than 10% for sure. Actually, I think last time I checked in terms of kind of global donations in the US, I think it's less than 5% of all kind of charitable donations in the US are kind of going global, basically, right? So it's in terms of kind of the most reviewed preference, it's even lower than in some of those surveys that I've done. And so I think in this sense, kind of rhetorically, it doesn't seem to be a good idea, especially when you are doing kind of not a particularly targeted campaign, right? So I think you can definitely, if you talk to an audience of pro-immigration advocates and academics, I think it's totally fine to talk about humanitarian concerns, right? But I think when you're a political party, it's definitely not something that is resonating with anyone, right? So I think in this sense, kind of rhetorically, I think it definitely makes sense to really push on the lever of national interest, right? And I think that's pretty much what a lot of political actors are already doing, right? So I think what I would argue that is just not going to be sufficient just to do it rhetorically. And in fact, one thing that I noticed when I first published some of those findings about those charitable donations and how they relate to immigration attitudes a couple of years ago in the form of an academic paper, I saw that most folks actually interpreted it in terms of exactly kind of policy communication, nothing else, right? It's really like just, if people care about national interest, then we should just emphasize it over and over again everywhere. And I don't think it's wrong, but I definitely think it's incomplete because that's something that we've been doing a lot, right? Various actors from nonprofits to governments. But I think, just telling people yet again, that, immigration is actually good and they just were misinformed about it, I don't think it's gonna do the trick, right? Just because, again, we know from a lot of research, including my own, that when you do those kind of survey experiments, people just don't update their preferences like that. So I think what's missing here is this kind of the reality component, right? And, of course, we know that people are very misinformed about not just immigration issues, but like any public policy issues. I don't think it's because people are stupid, right? It's just people have better things to do in their lives. And so I don't think we should expect people to be very knowledgeable about policy issues, including immigration, right? So I think that's why I'm trying to kind of really propagate this idea of what I call demonstrably beneficial policies. Basically, the idea is that those are the policies that are going to be intuitively understandable to all folks, regardless of their background. So the idea is that, you shouldn't have to have a PhD in economics to understand why immigration is good for you, right? And so when you come up with a policy like that, then I think you're on a really good path, right? But I think you really have to not just talk about national interest, but actually do something that people would intuitively understand as national interest too, right? But, the problem here is that it's going to take time.
It would be so much easier if we could just talk about it. No, I've been talking about this for quite a while, and it's just, it is very frustrating that, I feel like the evidence is very, very strong that immigration is beneficial for the countries that receive the immigrants, that, there may be some isolated cases where some people are harmed, but on net, the benefits are huge. And we're going to see that if we kick all the immigrants out, we're going to learn our lesson very quickly, I think. But I think you're right that it's not just enough to say that. You can say it, but it's very hard to change people's minds sometimes, especially given media environments and epistemic bubbles that people live in. You've talked about these kind of ideas of policies that are more self-evidently beneficial, that just strike people as common sense. What are some of those policies? What, in your mind, would a well-designed immigration system look like that is both allows for a high level of immigration and, does so in an orderly way and does so in a way that generates public support?
Basically Canada until a couple of years ago, I would say. And I think, it's still going pretty strong, right? So I think there has been a lot of conversation about some of the kind of a reversal of public opinion in Canada too, right? But in the end of the day, you don't have a single mainstream political actor who is advocating for a significantly cutting immigration. And even with some of those kind of cuts for international students that they are discussing right now, it's still going to be much more open than the US and most other countries, right? So I think it's important kind of not to lose sight of it. But kind of more generally, I would say that the most prototypical case of a demonstrably beneficial policy is skilled immigration. And actually, I think it's kind of might be a good idea to just stop here for a little bit and talk about it, just because, I think it's just such a strong evidence that we have in terms of how popular it is across a variety of different contexts. It's really it's amazing to me. Like, it doesn't matter how you like ask the survey question, right? So, we have a lot of those kind of things where, the posters can like kind of ask the question in a particular way, and then a lot of people are going to be more supportive or less supportive, right? When it comes to skilled immigration or high skilled immigration, it's really not possible to kind of phrase the question so that most people would be opposed to it. And it's also the case that more people are supportive of it compared to kind of lower skilled immigration, humanitarian immigration. But it's also like the majority of people usually is in favor of just increasing it regardless of what's happening with kind of lower skilled immigration. And we also see that it's something that's popular across all possible kind of contexts. It's not just, one particular country that needs it, right? It just seems like something that a lot of people would be on board with. And I think here, it's just a slam dunk case because, basically those, skilled migrants are usually kind of by design, they bring a lot of contribution in terms of taxation, right? And they feel kind of critical labor shortages usually that, people can understand why they're needed. One of my co-authors actually did a really cool study where what they tried to do basically is to kind of pose a hypothetical to voters. Let's say, we have a skilled immigrant and they lose their job, or they just decide not to use their skills, right? And, that's something that actually has been happening in Canada. They have this kind of anecdote of like an Indian PhD driving an Uber or something like that. And so when something like that happens, actually the support goes down. And I think the fact that it goes down, it does indicate again that this is mostly based on this kind of sociotropic concern about what's good for the country, not something else, right? We still have some of my colleagues, not really buying this idea, right? Because people just might be saying that they want what's best for their country, but what they really mean is that they don't want to like compete with people on the job market who look different from them. They just don't want to like kind of see those ethnically different people. And I think obviously there's a lot of that, but I think the fact that the skilled immigration is usually just so popular among all kinds of voters, conservative and liberal, right? So there was this Pew survey that you might have seen probably where they surveyed people just before the election, and they divided everyone into those kind of more extreme buckets of the Trump supporters and the Harris supporters. And for both groups, basically the support for skilled immigration was about like 90% or something like that. So I think this is probably the most prototypical idea of demonstrably beneficial policies. But what I'm trying to do in the book as well is to kind of figure out how we can go beyond that. Because obviously, a lot of folks are interested in bringing all kinds of immigrants. And, we have a lot of economic evidence that, a lot of countries, they don't just need skilled immigration, nothing else, right? There is a lot of value in all kinds of immigration. And so what I'm trying to kind of establish is that, it's just basically anywhere where those benefits are going to be immediately clear to people. And kind of one example that I really like that I think no one really talks about. Just you really don't have any stories about that, but like the immigration of immediate relatives, it's completely uncontroversial, right? So we have this kind of idea of chain migration, which obviously sometimes is unpopular among some kind of right wing individuals and politicians, but when it comes to immediate relatives, is basically no one is ever opposing it, right? If you talk to like the staunchest Trump supporter, they would say, of course, American citizens have their right to invite their foreign spouses. In fact, Trump famously did it himself a number of times, right? But we still see that, the immigration process for this particular pathway is very, very convoluted right now in the US.
So I think this is an interesting idea, and it strikes me as common sense to some degree that obviously there's going to be more support for skilled immigration than for unskilled immigration. And the more obvious the benefit is, the more people are going to support things. But I'm curious about the state of the evidence on this and how different countries fit into different contexts here, because you mentioned Canada, and Canada is a great example of this where I feel like the evidence in Canada pulls a little bit both ways, where I think Canada just has a baseline higher support for immigration than the US does. I think they accept, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but they accept more immigrants like per capita uh, in comparison to their size than the United States does. And despite them accepting more, they have a higher support for it. And so that, that could be because of their skill-based system that, they have a very like points-based system. You have to be highly skilled for the most part to get into Canada. But at the same time, when immigration increased in Canada, when people felt like the system was increasing and there were too many people coming in, I guess, support for immigration in Canada has declined noticeably since that happened in the last few years. And there's been a reaction against that. And like I talked to Canadian friends of mine who are worried that like Canadians are going to stop supporting immigration because of what's happening. So, I mean, what do you think about Canada as kind of, is it strong evidence for what you're talking about? Is this backlash worrying to you at all? Does it invalidate the thesis?
Yeah, so I've been thinking a lot about Canada, and I'm personally invested because I think one of the most convincing pieces of evidence that I have in the book is this a qualitative comparison of kind of the historical evolution of policies and public opinion in Canada, which again this kind of prototypical skill-based or kind of demonstrably beneficial system, and Sweden, which I would argue is the opposite of it, where they're kind of explicitly humanitarian based and sort of like have a relatively negative selection of immigrants. And so obviously, if the support for immigration completely collapses in Canada, I think I can, tell you right now that it's going to invalidate definitely a part of my thesis. I think what's been happening there over the past several years, I don't think it was just because of the numbers, although, the numbers might be important in conjunction with some of the housing policies, right? So another thing that we can talk a little bit about at some point is, this kind of idea that immigration is not there by itself, right? Obviously, it's also related to a lot of the other policies that people care about, and housing is a huge part of it, as we just learned. But I think it's not just about the numbers. I think it's just about how those numbers are managed. And I think the biggest problem in Canada was that this international student route that has skyrocketed over the past several years, it was not something that was designed in the system, right? And in fact, I think there was a really good report by the Economic Innovation Group a couple of months ago where they kind of tried to debunk this idea that kind of international student migration is good no matter what, right? I think in general, student migration is relatively demonstrably beneficial. It's pretty popular in the US and most other countries, right? But still, some kind of simplistic ideas, right? Just stamp green cards to all diplomas. They don't seem to work out just because of the incentive system, right? That you would have those kind of universities just kind of doing migration for the government, which not something that people would like, in either kind of political party or ideology. So yeah, so I don't know. I think the setbacks that we had in Canada, if anything, they just tell me that the Canada should just go back to what they've been doing lately. And I think another aspect of Canada, which is often underappreciated, is that just the strength of their professional immigration bureaucracy. And what they often do is that they're really good at adjusting to kind of changing realities, right? So they had a lot of bugs. So like the initial point-based system that they had, for instance, it did not um, it did not factor in the employer demand for immigrants, right? So there was no additional point you can get if you have a job offer. And it kind of led to this idea and the phenomenon of kind of skilled people doing low skilled jobs. And so, they adjusted, right? So they just added points for that to have a job offer. And I think it really helped the system. I think that's kind of what they're trying to do. And I think right now with the new liberal government, they gonna try to solve some of those issues. I mean, they're not gonna be completely be able to resolve housing, right? As we all know, it's just not gonna be possible in the English speaking world.
Don't get me started on
Yeah,
the housing crisis either. We're not that's a whole nother topic.
yeah,
I suspect I'm very sympathetic to what you're saying there.
yeah. I think it's a handicap, right? It's just the same thing with the having a long border in the South in the U.S., right? I think obviously Canada doesn't have that, and it helps them a lot. And so actually, some people just say that the reason why Canada is different from the U.S. is just because they don't have the southern border, and there's something to that, right? But I think we should just think about it as a handicap that it's just going to mean that immigration and making it popular is going to be a more uphill battle, right? But there are also, I think, certain things that make it easier to make it popular in the US than in some of the other countries, right? So we have a lot of self-selection going on in the US where, the best and the brightest actually trying to get to the US before any other country, right? And I do have sometimes this suspicion that, if, let's say, you are a very small European country, let's say you're like Estonia, or I don't know, Poland, even, right? And you implement everything that I recommend in my book, right? I don't think it's just gonna do the trick just because no one's gonna want to come there, right? Or at least not as many people as in the U.S. or some of the other cases. So I think we have this kind of self-selection process going on that is really helpful.
That's true. I will say that Poland may surprise you in a little bit. Like Poland is not that far from being richer on a per capita basis than many Western European countries. If they keep growing at the rate they're growing in 10 years, like they will be richer than England, I think, which is an astonishing number. But just to say, don't sleep on Poland.
Oh yeah, no, I completely agree. And they also accepted more immigrants over the last several years than most other European countries, and not just Ukrainian refugees. They actually have guest workers from Southeast Asia that like most people are just completely unaware of. Actually, I'm going there next week to talk about my book, so we'll see what people say there. But I think
Good luck there. I think we're going to be, 20 years ago, there was a stereotype of all these, Polish workers that would come to the UK and do like dirty jobs. Your plumber would be Polish or whatever. And at 30 years from now, we might be in the situation where a bunch of English people go to live in Poland to do their dirty jobs. But we'll see. And there's one point I wanted to return to about just the professional nature of Canada's bureaucracy, that they have a really good immigration system. I don't have any firsthand knowledge of this, but I know that it's a factor in U.S. immigration policy that nobody really talks about, is that institutions like ICE and like CPB and all of our immigration and border control institutions, the polite way to say it is that they are not talent attractors. Um, the impolite way to say it is that there's a lot of people who couldn't even cut it as cops in small towns, and so they go work for ICE, and that it is filled with some of the worst, dumbest people that you'll ever meet. And I think that actually really influences like U.S. immigration policy in a lot of unspoken ways, that like the type of person who ends up becoming like a CPB agent or an ICE agent or in the bureaucracy there is just not it's not a talent attractor.
yeah. But I think, I think a bigger problem that we have though is just like it's really hard to make any legal reforms, right? To create any new legal pathways. I'm not even talking about a comprehensive reform. Like even if you want to have like some kind of one time deal on some particular kind of visa or whatever, is just not something that is feasible right now in today's Congress. And so
Yeah, the political aspects are really hard in America. Ever since the Gang of Eight bill failed all the way back in like 2011 or 2012 or something like that. It's impossible to get anything done on immigration. Um, there was one other country that I wanted to ask you about, because it's one country where I think the the economic case for immigration is super super strong. Um, the benefits seem to be fairly obvious, but it took this country a long, long time to accept like any levels of immigration, and their levels are still very low.
You're talking about Japan, right?
Yes, I am talking about Japan. Japan, for those who are not familiar, has had a declining population for quite a while, for a couple decades, I think. Their population is in decline. It's getting much, much older. And so they're in this situation where, they really, really need immigrants to do jobs that no one else will do. There's not enough young Japanese people that exist. And so the economic case for immigration has been very strong there for a long time, but it just feels like they've finally made some progress. They are finally accepting more immigrants than they used to, but it feels like it took them a very long time to get over that hump. I'm not sure. How do you think like Japan just plays into this conversation that we're having?
It plays a lot into this conversation. Actually, last year I had a sabbatical and I spent the whole fall in Japan because exactly of what you're talking about, because I think it's a fascinating case of how you can make immigration popular out of nowhere. And I think a lot of it, I wouldn't call it an economic necessity. I think I would call it more like a demographic necessity. But it's it's something that in their context is demonstrably beneficial, right? So you need basically all kinds of migration, including temporary workers programs that they have right now. Um, Otherwise, you're just not going to be able to run the economy or the country at all. So, when I went there, and I don't speak Japanese, I should say, right? But hopefully, a lot of people have those kind of Google Translate machines or kind of translators on um, their phones. And, I talk to people who live in some of those, villages close to Tokyo where, you have hundreds and thousands of abandoned homes and, a lot of old people just dying by themselves. And there, you talk to like an average person who is still there in the village and they completely understand right now that if it wasn't for that person from Vietnam who is running their ramen shop, then it's just nothing's gonna happen there, right? And so they might not be, again, the most cosmopolitan person in the world, right? They probably have some prejudice. Um, but they are willing to accept those folks at least temporarily. So there's an interesting tension happening in Japan where the government, it's still kind of very self-conscious in terms of not using the word immigration, which implies some kind of permanence, right? So they're still mostly talking about foreign work and the need for foreign work. And as you said, I mean, they have made significant progress. I think they basically quadrupled their foreign-born population over the last 10 years or so. And I think it's just going up and up. I think, I agree with you that they probably are moving a little bit too slow. But at the same time, we also don't see any significant pushback from the public, right? Just in terms of kind of the Japanese system, you can totally imagine how they might have like a right-wing populist party, like I had in Germany, right? It's not happening yet, right? I think there's definitely demand for this. You can, there's so little crime in Japan, for instance, that even if you have like one single criminal incident committed by anyone with a foreign origin, right, it can just be blown up out of proportion completely, right? Just because like no one commits any crime there, right? Which is a very different situation, let's say, from the US.
Well, and that actually, can I ask a question about crime? Just while we're on the subject, because I don't want to forget to ask this. One of the things that I get pushback from, because I take a broadly liberal stance here, that immigration is good, but, I differ from the leftist stance where, I think it's good for everyone. I think it's good for America. I think it's good for the immigrant. I think we should do it for reasons of economic prosperity and not as a form of charity necessarily. And I talk about this with friends of mine who are on the left. And one of the pieces of pushback I get is about the original start of what we were talking about was racism. And they say things like, look, maybe most people are not racists, but there are racists that exist, some percentage of the population, and they're always going to take advantage of anything that happens. There one Mexican guy or one El Salvadorian guy, ends up killing someone, And the racists are going to take it and they're going to use their media circles. They're going to, talk about immigrant crime and your children aren't safe. And, they've got this whole ecosystem of conservative media. And like, how are we supposed, basically their point is, maybe not everyone's a racist, but the racists are in charge of the media ecosystem. They dominate in many social media spaces, and Fox News is just always blaring on about immigrant crime, regardless of the actual statistics of do immigrants commit more crime than native-born Americans? Probably not, based on the stats I've seen. But it's very easy to kind of blow up those stories, as you say. And I wonder, like, how do we fight that? Is it something where we just have to continually emphasize the obvious benefits of like skill-based immigration? I, I, can we? I mean, I don't. I guess I don't have a solution here. I'm curious how you think about this problem.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked this actually. So I think in general, people who are on the more pro-immigration side and they realize kind of the potential benefits of immigration, they should be much more willing, strategically even, to call out their own side and when they're not making sense empirically. And I think the crime issue, I think, is very tricky here because we know from a lot of kind of US data, compiled by like Alex Narasta and other folks at Cato, and many other people, is that, in the US, immigrants of all kinds of statuses, including illegal and undocumented migrants, are much less likely to commit crimes, right? A lot of it is actually just due to incentives, right? You don't want to commit any infraction just because you don't want to get deported. And right now, we heard all those stories about students potentially getting deported because of like fishing tickets or something like that, right? So you can imagine why it is happening, but it's not true in many other countries, right? And I think it's important to kind of not, kind of extrapolate this evidence. And I see that a lot in Europe where people cite the US evidence and then say that immigrants commit less crime in Europe. But it's not true. Like in Sweden, the country that I spent a lot of time kind of reading and thinking a lot about in the book, right? It's not true that immigrants commit less crime. It's most likely the opposite. It's also the case when, if you look at kind of fiscal benefits, that it's unambiguously true that an average foreign-born person in Sweden contributes less in taxes than they consume in social benefits. And I think that's something that you have to acknowledge, right? So you can like say that potentially they might have some indirect fiscal benefits or something like that. Like, we have a lot of kind of research on that, and this is fine. I don't think it would be demonstrably beneficial, right? Because I think those kind of models of indirect fiscal benefits, I think the one that makes the most sense to me is kind of showing that when immigrants take those essential jobs, right, the natives can potentially go up in the career ladder. Right. So I think it makes sense to me. It makes sense to people like us. Right. But I think it's not something that a lot of voters are going to be able to intuitively accept and understand. And I think in terms of crime specifically, I think people should be absolutely willing to accept uncomfortable statistics, right? I think you have another issue here where, some nativists would say that even single crime is more than enough, right? And you would see those stories in Fox News that, if this illegal alien was not here, then none of this would have happened. Right. And so the idea is that, basically you have to minimize the cost of immigration and you can ignore all the potential benefits. But that's not how public policy works, right? If you deport and not let anyone in, yeah, sure, there are going to be no foreign crime, but you're also not going to get any foreign benefits, right? And it's just like people completely ignore that for some reason.
Yeah, it's hard with. I think it's hard from two directions because number one, it's easier to see concentrated cost rather than diffuse benefits, right? That if one person gets murdered by an immigrant, that's very visible. And the broad economic gain from 30 other immigrants who didn't do anything other than contribute to society, that's like hard to point at in the same way. I also think that the average person tends more towards zero sum thinking. It's easier to think, oh, this immigrant took my job or they took my spot, rather than to think in positive sum. And we're seeing the same thing with trade, where the current US president doesn't understand the idea of a positive sum game. As long as we are criticizing our own sides, I will say that I do think there are instances where that zero sum thinking actually they do have a point. And what I will specifically say, I said I wasn't going to rant about housing, but I can never stop myself from ranting about housing. In a country like Canada, where they build virtually no housing. Canada has huge housing crisis in all of its major cities. The cost of living is shooting up. And legitimately, if you let in a bunch more people, if the population dramatically increases and you don't build any more housing, like they build almost zero, that's pretty much a zero sum game in the sense that immigrants are going to make your life worse because they drove up your cost of living. Maybe they make your life better in other ways. Maybe there are other economic benefits, but it's hard to look at your rent going up and your city getting more crowded. And maybe you got pushed to an outlying area where you have to commute for an hour and a half now. Like, if you don't build any housing, then some of the economy becomes a zero sum game. And so I think you have to, if you're accepting more people, you have to build more housing as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I agree with that. I think, it's on the Canadian government at the time not to recognize that, right? Because I think, again, you should not expect regular voters to understand those trade-offs, right? And I think it's true that a lot of folks are gravitating toward this kind of zero-sum thinking. So I guess the idea is that we should discourage it as much as possible. But sometimes, and some things are truly zero-sum. There was actually, a very fascinating study a couple of years ago where some researchers at Stanford, they basically did a targeted survey of like tech people in San Francisco and the Silicon Valley, and they asked them about their H-1B preferences. And, those are like very liberal, educated people who you would otherwise, expect to be super pro-immigration, almost like open borders. And guess what? I mean, they were like decidedly more against those H-1B visas compared to the general population. And so the self-interest kicks in too at some point, right? It's just like in general, when it comes to immigration policy, it's hard to make those calculations. But for some people and some groups, it's definitely going to happen. I think what we see here is that really you have to figure out what the good policies are first. As a government, as a responsible government, right, you have to figure out what policies are good and then try to subset those policies to those that are more demonstrably beneficial that people would be able to understand. But, if you have both sides of the government, either liberals or conservatives, basically trying to preach to the other side and just doing those symbolic policies, right, trying to kind of deport someone or try to like protest immigrant rights, right? So actually one, aspect that we haven't really discussed yet, right, is that a lot of kind of pro-immigration action is really focused on immigrant rights, right? Which it's understandable, right? But I think it's very detrimental to the goal of ensuring that, immigration flows are more open, right? Because there's very little constituency for that, right? So people can relate to folks who are already here, right? I think some people call it like the stock premium, basically, right? So even if you're kind of a conservative voter, right, you see those undocumented people as a part of your community, at least to a certain extent, right? But it's much harder for you to relate to a hypothetical or counterfactual worker from like Zambia or something who cannot come because there is no legal pathways for them to come.
Yeah, and I think I think that you're right. People generally don't care as much about the rights of immigrants. The exception to that is Trump. And when he does things that are just unbelievably cruel, in his first administration, this was, keeping kids in cages. I think that actually woke people. They're like, okay, well, we don't care about immigrant rights that much, but we're not necessarily cool that like kids in cages is the front story on the nightly news every night. This time it seems, they've stepped it up and now they're sending random people to El Salvadorian torture gulags. And so maybe that breaks through as well. But that feels like playing defense. It feels like we're not, if we're just playing defense the whole time, then we're not actually making any progress. And, it feels to me, one thing I've said for a long time is that the average American has no idea what our level of immigration is. They have absolutely no idea did we have more immigrants in 2024 or 2023? They absolutely could not tell you. They don't even have the slightest idea. They have no way to measure that. But what they respond to is kind of the perception of chaos. That if they're reading stories about how there's caravans coming over the border, or the system is flooded, or this, that kind of thing, they respond to very strongly. Should we increase the amount of legal visas is a question that has like no political salience, but like, is the border being overrun is a question that has incredibly strong political salience, and people react to that way, way stronger than I would have anticipated, 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah, but it's not just all made up though, right? I think sometimes there is this kind of fatalistic view that, no matter how good the situation is at the border, Fox News is definitely going to exaggerate it. They're going to blow it out of the proportion.
Oh no, like I will fully admit that under Biden, we had a crisis at the border. We were not taking care of the border that in the way that we should have, in the way that the law said we probably should have, and we didn't have the system in place to deal with it, and so we were overwhelmed 100%.
Yeah. So imagine if we had so much labor shortage, right, in the aftermath of COVID, right? So what if instead of accepting millions of people, using the asylum route, the Congress could have, instead figured out some kind of work visa situation where we would actually give those people a work visa that they can come legally, maybe for a couple of years with some kind of pathway for more permanent migration. I think that would have been a much more popular thing to do. It's just not something that Congress can do at the moment, unfortunately.
So we are coming up on time here, unfortunately. So I want to ask the traditional final question that we often ask on this podcast, and that is, where can people go to learn more? I will be happy to first recommend your book. It's a book by Alexander Kustov. It's called In Our Interest: How Democracies Can Make Immigration Popular. It expands on everything we're talking about here in much more detail, much more technical detail, much more nuanced arguments. There will be more content there in the book. It'll be further than we've been able to get here in 1 hour. So I'm very happy to recommend your book. But other than your book, what else would you recommend for people who are interested in this conversation about all the things we've been talking about? Whether this is, reports to read, other books, other podcasts to listen to, people to follow on social media, where should they go for information?
Yeah. So just kind of building on what you said, I can highly recommend some of my colleagues who do this kind of similar work on immigration attitudes. Just on the top of my mind, there's a really great book by Maurice Levy and Matthew Wright. It's called Immigration and the American Ethos. And it kind of also takes a very broad view of immigration attitudes and what determines them. And they see my book certainly as a successor to what they've done. There's also a lot of great research done on immigration attitudes by Justin Guest at George Mason University. And I would also highly recommend the work of Omar Saladak, who has written a number of papers on the perception of border security and how improving those perceptions can potentially make people more open to, freer immigration in terms of the admission routes. In terms of my own research, I would just recommend folks to go to my website, alexanderkustov.org. I've also been writing a lot for Good Authority, which is a popular political science blog. I'm covering immigration and right-wing populism there together with a number of other great authors. So I would highly recommend this resource too for those who are interested in the topic of immigration and public opinion.
Well, one more time, the book is In Our Interest: How Democracies Can Make Immigration Popular. It's a very important topic, I think, for the future of America and the planet as a whole. I want to thank my guest one more time, Alexander Kustov. Thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you, Jeremiah. It was a pleasure.